Passover is the telling and the retelling of the meta-Jewish liberation narrative, the story that a people who were oppressed and downtrodden and abused and degraded for hundreds of years somehow were able to make the journey from slavery to freedom, from degradation to dignity, from narrowness to great expansive possibility. And the story of that journey is so important for us to remember that even before we actually left Egypt, our people were taught, this is how you'll remember this once it actually happens. And so every year we go into this very deep exercise in remembering during the 8 days of Passover. And we observe in very profound and very visceral ways the rituals of Passover so that we can remember what the experience of the degradation was and what it means to be a people who are taken from degradation and given possibility of dignity once again. Every single Shabbat on Friday night, as the sun goes down and you take a glass of wine or grape juice in hand, we remind ourselves of the experience of being tortured and humiliated in slavery, and then God's hand reaching into human history and human beings partnering with God to walk toward our own redemption. And even every day, several times a day in the liturgy that traditional Jews recite, we remind ourselves of the experience of the Exodus from Egypt, what it felt like to walk to freedom. We have to make sure that it feels real to us, as real to us in 2,000 years as it does in this moment where we're actually walking into our freedom. And so all of the rituals around Passover are designed to shake us out of our complacency and basically awaken us to the memory of the experience from Egypt, so that it's not only that we're remembering a story that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents told, but we're actually remembering it in our own human experience, that I remember walking from slavery to freedom because I was also there. It's also built into my consciousness. Michael Walzer, who's the great political theorist and writer, writes that wherever you are, it's probably Egypt. We live in this very paradoxical relationship with slavery that's enunciated through the pages of the Haggadah, where the book that we use to guide us through the Seder experience, in which we both articulate that we are free and we're celebrating our freedom, but also we are still slaves and maybe next year we'll be free. And there's this idea that on one hand we are free and we're incredibly privileged right now. This could be one of the greatest moments of Jewish history, being able to live freely and as free human beings. To be able to live freely in the United States in the 21st century brings with it extraordinary privilege. And at the same time, we're not yet free. And so we ask this question of how can it be that we are free and not free? And Michael Walzer's teaching is so powerful because this place is also Egypt. It's also Egypt for the millions of undocumented workers who have come to this country to find a better life and have been denied the warm and welcoming embrace that our grandparents and great-grandparents received when they came to this place. It is still Egypt for the millions and millions of people who work every day, several full-time jobs, and can't afford to pay their rent, and people who've been separated from loved ones, people who are just part of the masses of people who really struggle for basic visibility, for basic dignity and human rights in this country, and not only here, but around the world. And so we recognize that our freedom is intimately linked to the freedom of those who are most vulnerable in our society today, and we can't be fully free until they are also free. At the same time, we also realize that our freedom is not just a political and social freedom, but it's also an emotional and spiritual freedom. And for many of us, even though we've achieved some kind of political, civil, social freedom, we remain imprisoned for a variety of reasons in different ways in our own lives. And so part of what Passover is also coming to do is make grand sweeping statements about human dignity and about what society could and ought to look like, but also statements about individual personal freedom and what our lives could look like and what we ought to aspire to as individuals. We have the greatest big Jewish idea, which is the idea that it's possible to move from slavery to freedom and from darkness to light and from despair to hope. That is the greatest Jewish story ever told. What we need to do is figure out how to articulate that in a voice that people will actually hear and take so seriously that it literally reverberates through every aspect of their lives, that it affects every interaction they have and helps shape them into human beings who will continue to walk in this walk toward liberation personally and globally. So our job as a community is to articulate, create a kind of collective ethos of Passover. We are Passover Jews. We're Exodus Jews. And then to position ourselves spiritually, to prepare ourselves spiritually so that we're ready when we go into our individual homes on Seder night, that we're ready to receive the inspiration that will flow. And I believe that the objective of Passover is to reach one moment of spiritual clarity on Passover where we actually feel as though we ourselves were slaves in Egypt and had been redeemed. But in reality, what most of us do when we're sitting around the Passover table doesn't begin to touch the depths of what's actually possible. And so what we want to do is we do a lot of learning around the Passover experience so that people can actually begin to prepare their hearts so that when they're sitting there, they can have the full experience of Passover. So it doesn't just feel like a nice, lovely, communal, familial gathering where we maybe talk about freedom, but where people actually feel even brought to tears because the memory is so strong of what happened to us and the commitment is so profound of making sure that we do everything in our power to reduce or eliminate the systems that create that kind of continued impoverishment and degradation of human beings today. I think actually the symbols on the Seder plate are some of the most powerful ways of communicating what the essence of the Passover experience really is about. So we have the egg, which is the symbol of the possibility of something completely new entering into the world. We have the karpas, the greens, which is something that seems like it's completely dead, finding new life. So, you know, as we go through the seasons, when it seems like a tree has no life left in it, all of a sudden there's a new blossom and a new bud, and Passover coming in the springtime especially, this is reinforced. So something that seems like all life has been snuffed out of it, all of a sudden comes to life again. There is the charoset, the sweet, this sweet tasting apple cinnamon mixture, which actually comes to remind us of the bricks and mortar when we were slaves in Egypt, which I think is so interesting. There's something about this sort of sweetness of being stuck in a life that you know you don't want to stay in, but is comfortable because you've been there for a long time and you know it and you understand the contours of it and the boundaries of it. And then on the other side, there's chazeret, the lettuce, which is a kind of bitter lettuce, which comes to remind us that even once we're in freedom, there's a kind of bitterness that comes with everything that's unknown. Once we enter into this place of freedom, at least in Egypt, we knew where our food was coming from. We knew what time of day we would eat. But once we walked into the desert, much of the Torah is the Israelites kvetching, complaining to Moses and the leadership and to God, saying, send us back to Egypt. The food was better. And so I think the chazeret, the lettuce, is about the bitterness of freedom, actually. So we have the sweetness of slavery and the bitterness of freedom, paradoxically. And then there's the bitter herb, which is the most powerful symbol, which is you're supposed to taste enough of this bitter herb that a tear runs from your eye, that we cannot experience freedom without remembering what the pain and suffering of the past was actually about. And the shank bone, the symbol of the Paschal lamb, which in my family we use grapes instead, is symbolic. But there are a lot of vegetarian versions of the shank bone. But the idea of this is that freedom came to the Israelite people after the night that they were willing to go out and actually put the blood on the doorposts of their home and say, I'm ready to take part in my own liberation right now. So for the first 9 plagues, the Israelites didn't do anything. Moses lifted a staff and God made a plague happen. But for the 10th plague, the Israelites actually had to go out and publicly affirm that they wanted to be part of their own liberation story. And once they did that, then freedom was able to come. And so we have all of these rituals laid out in the center of the table. In some ways, the more bizarre they are, the better, because it sparks conversation. And then the children will ask, why do we have an egg on the table? Why do we dip the karpas in salt water? So we have these symbols in order to evoke questions and also to evoke memory. So much of Jewish ritual and Jewish life is about putting the brakes on so that we don't let one day roll into another day, roll into a year, roll into a decade, and all of a sudden say, where did my life go? But actually creating signposts along the way where we can say, a week has ended. Let me reflect on the past week and think about the coming week. A month has ended. Who do I want to be in the month that comes? Another year has gone by. Who am I? What was not the best of me? How can I unstick myself from patterns and paradigms that are unhelpful for me? And so Jewish ritual is actually designed to create the space for us to reflect in this very deep and profound way about life. The Passover ritual is all the more so. It's this very dramatic break in what's normal and what's usual in our lives so that we're forced to say this is not business as usual. The cleansing of our homes is part of the cleansing of the soul. In what ways am I still rooted in a paradigm that holds me down and doesn't allow me to actually become the person that God put me in the world to be? In what ways do I allow fear and lack of hope and narrowness to prevent me from engaging in the world in the most dynamic and most effective way possible? So we cleanse our homes and we get rid of all of the chametz, all of the stuff that reminds us of what it means to sit around and to allow someone else's rules about the world dictate the way that we live. And we get it out of our home. We can't own it. We can't look at it. We can't eat it. We can't engage it. And then we eat in this totally and completely different way for 8 days so that our stomachs feel different. Our bodies feel different over the course of that time so that with every bite, we have the opportunity to remind ourselves of the deep and powerful message of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of this exodus from Egypt, of the possibility of movement from narrowness to expansiveness and from darkness to light, and to think about what would it mean to imagine a city and a country and a world in which we were actually able to make movement on this journey from slavery to freedom, and what would it mean for me to imagine myself taking another step forward on the walk from the place of exile back to the place of home, from being who I have become to being the person who I'm supposed to really be in the world. With every single bite of food for 8 days, we remind ourselves of this very powerful message of possibility. Matzah is the most powerful food substance there is, because it is, on one hand, the bread of affliction. We hold it up at the beginning of the Seder and say, halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of poverty, and it's also the bread of freedom. And so how can it be that one substance is both the symbol of our impoverishment and our degradation, and also the symbol of possibility and the symbol of freedom? And it happens that the way that we engage the matzah is what changes, not the substance itself. But when we fight over resources, so then we are like people who are impoverished and degraded and enslaved, and living in a slave mentality. But when we share our resources, when we live from a place of abundance instead of from a mindset of only scarcity, it's either mine or it's yours. When instead we say, come in and share this meal with me, share this bread with me, so then it becomes the bread of freedom. It doesn't taste delicious. It's just the most basic substance. It's like tasteless matter, because the taste of life comes from the spice that we're willing to put into it. But it can either be a reminder of what's missing in our lives or a reminder of the incredible abundance that we have. And there's a story that Primo Levi tells, who tells about his experience in the days that followed immediately from the liberation of the concentration camp that he was living in. And he talks about how he was left behind because the Germans, as the Germans were retreating, they took with them as many Jews who could make it on the death marches away from the concentration camps. But those who were ill remained behind in the camps, and they only had a few scraps of food left. And after a couple of days, he talks about, he remembers this moment where some of the prisoners turned to one another and they said, we have a few scraps of bread, let's share what we have so that we can all survive. And he said that was the moment that they became free. When you share the bread of affliction, it becomes the bread of freedom. When you realize that even though we're suffering, we still have the capacity in our hearts to be human beings to one another, to see into someone else's suffering and say, I'm part of this story and I will help you walk toward freedom and survive. That's when it becomes the bread of freedom. And so matzah really is the most powerful food substance that exists, because it completely captures both what it means to be afflicted and denigrated, and also what it means to be completely spiritually free.